What is up, guys? Randomonium here, and I'm very pleased to announce that this is the long-awaited How to Find Your Ideal Playstyle, Class, and Subclass video for Season 8. If you're a fan of the channel, and you've seen my Season 7 version of this video, keep watching because the Season 8 video has a ton of new information in it. And if you're brand new to the channel, just stumbling onto this video for the first time, please feel free to leave a comment if anything in the video doesn't make sense. The whole point of this video is to help people find their main champion and help people who've already found their main champion find other champions similar to that champion. I frequently struggled with figuring out who I want to main, so I came up with a system to help me determine which champions fit my playstyle best. The way this system works is that it breaks the 130 plus champions that League has into 13 subclasses based off of similar attributes. My system helps identify which subclasses you would enjoy most based on which attributes you prioritize. Once your ideal subclasses are identified, I further break down each subclass to help you find the exact champion or champions that you are looking for. So the most important question we have to answer with this video is what makes you happy in League? If we can answer this question, then finding the right class, subclass, and champion for you becomes much, much easier. Think back to your fondest memories in League. Was it that time you landed that 5-man ultimate that won the game? Was it the time that you saved your carry from multiple threats? Was it the time you outplayed that gank and got a double kill? Or was it the time that you landed that clutch skill shot that set up the teamfight win? Think about what you enjoy most about this game and why you keep hitting that play button over and over despite all the feeders and trolls and toxicity. Keep those thoughts in your mind for the rest of the video or write them down so you can refer back to them. Alright, so now we're going to do a little thought experiment to introduce you to the different classes and subclasses. I know this may be hard for some people, but for a moment, I want you to imagine that you're a Teemo main. If you were a Teemo main, what would you love most? Besides Anarchy and the blood of virgins and drinking the salty, salty tears of tilted players. Pentagrams, of course. Why pentagrams? Say it with me, everyone. Because Teemo is Satan. Good, I'm glad we're all on the same page. On the topic of Satan and pentagrams, there are 5 sides to a pentagram. You know what there are also 5 of in League of Legends? Darken. There are 5 Darken. Aatrox, Kayn, Varus, and 2 others that we don't know of yet. Coincidence? I think not. Clearly, Teemo must be behind the Darken. Either that, or it's aliens. But I digress. The whole reason I was bringing up pentagrams is to show you that there are also 5 main classes in the game. Slayers, fighters, tanks, controllers, and mages. And now that we've made it through that convoluted intro, let's banish this little guy back to whence he came. Well, that was creepy. So anyway, like I was saying, there are 5 main classes: Slayers, Fighters, Tanks, Controllers, and Mages. The classes are oriented in a pentagon, and as you can see, the colors from one class bleed into the colors from the adjacent classes. The reason for this is that all of the classes are on a spectrum, and the lines are frequently blurred where one class ends and another begins. The classes are oriented around the pentagon to show which classes they are most similar to, not to show which classes they counter. For example, the pentagon indicates that fighters are most similar to slayers and tanks, not that they counter mages and controllers. Each of the classes is pretty self-explanatory. Slayers are damage-focused melee champions. Fighters are melee champions who are a mix of damage and tankiness. Tanks are the toughest champions in the game. Controllers are more crowd control oriented or supportive spellcasters, and mages are more damage oriented spellcasters. Within each of these classes are offensive and defensive subclasses. Offensive subclasses are great at starting fights, chunking out enemies from long distances, or deleting enemies off the map with a single combo. Defensive classes are amazing at finishing fights. They are great when the enemy team tries to engage onto them, either because they have great 1v2 potential, or they have great ways to peel enemies off of their allies. The defensive subclasses are the subclasses closest to the center of the pentagon and are Skirmishers, Juggernauts, Wardens, Enchanters, and Battle Mages. The offensive subclasses are the subclasses closest to the outer edge of the pentagon and are Assassins, Divers, Vanguards, Catchers, Artillery Mages, and Burst Mages. Not only do the offensive and defensive subclasses within each class have a lot in common, offensive and defensive subclasses between adjacent classes also have a lot in common. For example, Divers have a lot in common with Assassins and Vanguards. That said, there are some exceptions to the rule with this spectrum of classes. For example, there are a few Divers who are very similar to the Skirmisher class, and there are a few Battle Mages who are also very similar to the Juggernaut class. Overall, the concept is pretty solid though, and it's very useful on how to visualize how each of the classes are interconnected. Another extremely important aspect of classes and subclasses is what class and subclass a champion belongs to does not change if they build different items or they take different runes. What subclass a champion belongs to is determined only by the champion's kit, and it's an intrinsic part of the champion that cannot be changed. For example, if you build a diver with all damage items, that does not make them an assassin. Likewise, if you build a diver with all tank items, that does not make them a vanguard. A diver is a diver, regardless of what items you build or what runes you take. Within the Slayer class, there are two subclasses, Assassins and Skirmishers. Assassins are the masters of burst damage and mobility, but have virtually no defensive tools or crowd control. Skirmishers are unparalleled duelists who have a good blend of damage and mobility, as well as a little bit of crowd control and defensive capabilities. Within the fighter class, we have two subclasses, Divers and Juggernauts. Divers have superior mobility and crowd control, while Juggernauts have increased tankiness and damage. Tanks also have two subclasses, Vanguards and Wardens. Vanguards have superior mobility to initiate team fights, while Wardens have superior utility to keep allies alive. Controllers are separated into Catchers and Enchanters. Catchers focus on punishing mispositioned enemies with powerful crowd control, while Enchanters focus on buffing allies and keeping enemies away. Mages actually have three subclasses, Artillery Mages, Burst Mages, and Battle Mages. Artillery Mages are longer ranged, while Burst Mages typically have more crowd control or more burst damage or more mobility than Artillery Mages. Battle Mages are shorter range than Artillery Mages and Burst Mages, but they have extremely high damage and very potent crowd control if you enter into their threat range. If you've been paying close attention, you've noticed that there are two classes that I haven't talked about yet, Marksmen and Specialists. These classes don't fall on the spectrum because each of them is incredibly diverse. For Marksmen, we have Marksmen that deal physical damage, we have Marksmen that deal magic damage, we have Marksmen who deal hybrid damage, we have Marksmen who rely on auto attacks, Marksmen who rely on spells, Marksmen who are with mobility, Marksmen with utility, Marksmen who are more duelists, Marksmen who are more team fighters, and Marksmen who are more assassins. Basically, the Marksman class by itself could be its own spectrum. For Specialists, it's a similar story. We have Specialists who focus on AoE damage, we have Specialists who are incredibly tanky, we have Specialists who are more Marksmen, we have Specialists who are more Assassins or Skirmishers, we even have Specialists with multiple forms whose subclass changes depending on which form they are in. We'll talk about each subclass in more detail once we figure out what the best subclass is for you. Each subclass is made up of 5 attributes: damage, toughness, crowd control, mobility, and utility. The way we're going to determine the best subclass for you is finding out which things you prioritize in a champion and then matching the right subclass to you. Think of it like a player-champion dating service. So think for a moment and prioritize these attributes from most important to least important. Keep in mind that just like there is no person who is amazing in every area, there are also no champions that are amazing in every area. You need to be willing to compromise and focus only on what are your must-haves in a champion. Each attribute has its own spectrum as well. For each attribute, you need to decide which side of the spectrum you prefer, or whether you prefer to be more in the middle. Once you prioritize each attribute and decide where you want to fall on the spectrum for each attribute, then we can determine which subclass is best for you. For damage, there is DPS and burst damage. Burst damage is better for picking off lone opponents and is very effective against squishy opponents, while DPS damage is better for team fighting, especially if the fight goes on for a long period of time or you're against multiple tanks. For toughness, there's mitigation and sustain. Mitigation is the negation of damage in the form of shields or resistances. Mitigation is highly effective against burst damage. Sustain is the healing of damage either through abilities or lifesteal. Sustain is highly effective against DPS damage. For crowd control, there are 2 types, soft and hard. Hard crowd control is any crowd control which prevents movement. The many forms of hard crowd control prevent any action at all. Soft crowd control includes things like slows, blinds, and silences that still allow the target to move, but impair them in some other way. For mobility, there's engage and reposition. Engages are typically long-range dashes or blinks designed to initiate a fight that typically have longer cooldowns. Reposition abilities are either short dashes or movement speed increases that allow a champion to quickly move into a more favorable position. For utility, there's defensive utility and offensive utility. Defensive utility are spells that help keep your allies alive, such as shields, heals, or other bonuses to resistances. Offensive utility are spells that increase the offensive capabilities of your allies, such as damage bonuses, attack speed buffs, or movement speed buffs. At this point in the video, you should have prioritized each attribute from most important to least important and decided which side of the spectrum sounds more appealing to you for each attribute. Now we're going to go through each attribute and talk about where each class falls on the spectrum. As we go through each attribute, make a note of which classes match your desired attributes. On each attribute graph, each subclass is going to be abbreviated based off of the first 3 letters of the subclass and will be colored based on what class they fall under. For example, the Assassin subclass will be abbreviated as ASS because those are the first 3 letters of Assassin, and because you're an ass if you main Assassins. Furthermore, you can see that both Assassins and Skirmishers are in red because they both fall under the Slayer class. This table is a very simplified version of the graphs that we're going to go over next. The point of this table is to give you a quick reference so that you can initially see which classes you may be interested in. The other point of this table is to show you that you can't have a class that's great at everything. As you can see from the table, each class only has 1 or 2 attributes that they're considered an S rating in, and multiple attributes where they're considered a D rating. Keep this in mind as we go through each attribute, and always remember what your priorities are. The first attribute we're going to talk about is damage. In the horizontal axis, you'll see that the subclasses on the left side of the graph deal more DPS damage, while the subclasses on the right deal more burst damage. How far each subclass is up on the graph indicates how much damage they normally do compared to other classes. Traditionally, Marksmen, battle mages, artillery mages, burst mages, and assassins deal the most damage in the game and are considered to be the primary damage dealers. Juggernauts and Skirmishers are slightly below these classes but can still deal massive amounts of damage in the right hands. Divers are directly beneath Juggernauts and Skirmishers and can deal as much damage as those classes if they build glass cannon, but typically divers build more tanky. Catchers are kind of a weird class when it comes to damage. Some catchers do virtually no damage, and some catchers do massive amounts of damage. Typically, the catchers who do a lot of damage are very squishy, and the catchers who don't do a lot of damage have more tankiness or utility. Vanguards and Wardens are next on the damage chart. They aren't known for their damage, but they can be a damage threat if the battle continues on long enough, since they mainly deal AoE DPS damage. At the bottom of the damage chart are the Enchanters. Enchanters have the lowest overall damage of any class in the game, but there are particular Enchanters who can still deal a surprising amount of damage. Remember, this is the League of Damage. Any class can deal significant amounts of damage if played accordingly. I've seen plenty of games where a Vanguard or a Warden or an Enchanter has hard carried and led our team in damage, so if damage is your number one priority, don't count out the classes that deal less damage just yet. The next attribute we're going to talk about is toughness. Subclasses that favor mitigation are on the left, while subclasses that favor sustain are on the right. The subclasses with the most toughness are Wardens, Vanguards, Juggernauts, and some battle mages. Battle mages are particularly difficult to characterize in regards to toughness because some battle mages are incredibly tanky while others are quite fragile. Divers are right beneath these classes and can be just as tanky as the tank classes depending on what items you get. Skirmishers are right below divers and are very hard to gauge in terms of toughness because their defenses are extremely situational and entirely dependent upon the skill of the player and the skill of his opponents. Beneath the Skirmishers we have the catchers. Like I previously discussed, there are some squishy catchers and there are some tanky catchers. Tanky catchers typically deal less damage than squishy catchers. At the bottom, we have Enchanters, Marksmen, Burst Mages, Artillery Mages, and Assassins. Enchanters and Marksmen can be deceptively tanky with their shields and their sustain, while Burst Mages, Artillery Mages, and Assassins hardly possess any forms of mitigation or sustain. For crowd control, we can see that the graph is greatly skewed towards hard crowd control. The kings and queens of crowd control are champions in the Catcher, Vanguard, and Warden classes. These classes typically have multiple forms of easy-to-hit CC that are extremely powerful. Immediately beneath them, we have Enchanters, Divers, and Burst Mages, who also possess significant crowd control. Underneath those classes, we have Battle Mages and Artillery Mages, who typically have at least one form of crowd control, but whose crowd control is usually either on a delay or is more difficult to hit. Beneath them, we have Assassins and Skirmishers. Assassins are one of the few classes that has more soft crowd control than hard crowd control, and Skirmishers have some potent stuns and knockups, but neither of these classes have great CC when compared to other classes. Marksmen and Juggernauts are extremely hard to classify when it comes to crowd control because the subclasses are extremely diverse. Some of these champions have soft crowd control, some have hard crowd control, and some have no crowd control. On the whole, Juggernauts have slightly more forms of crowd control than Marksmen, but neither class is known for their crowd control. Next up, we have mobility. In this category, Assassins are far and away the most mobile champions, possessing significant engage and reposition mobility. However, Divers and Skirmishers also have amazing mobility. Divers have great engage mobility, and Skirmishers have great reposition mobility. Vanguards are slightly beneath Divers because they typically only have one form of engage mobility, usually on a longer cooldown. The difference is that Vanguard engages are usually monumental team fight turning events. Wardens have slightly less engage potential than Vanguards, but usually have better utility to compensate. Catchers, like in many other categories, are all over the map when it comes to mobility. Some catchers have great mobility, others not so much. Next, we have Burst Mages and Marksmen. There are certain champions within both of these classes that are very mobile, but most champions within these classes are not mobile. And at the bottom, we have Battle Mages, Enchanters, Artillery Mages, and Juggernauts, who have some of the lowest mobility in the game. And finally, we have Utility. As you can see, most champions with Utility have defensive utility, though there are a few champions in the game with offensive utility. In this attribute, Enchanters are the hands-down undisputed champions. Directly beneath them are the Wardens, who sacrifice some utility for increased tankiness. Catchers are next in terms of utility, but they have significantly less utility than Enchanters and Wardens. There are a few champions within the Marksmen and Vanguard classes that have some utility, which is why these classes aren't at the bottom, but most champions within these classes don't possess any utility. Skirmishers, Burst Mages, Divers, Artillery Mages, Juggernauts, Assassins, and Battle Mages all don't possess any forms of utility. Another aspect we haven't really talked about yet is the concept of range, and where champions of particular subclasses should be positioned in fights. Here's a graphic showing the typical classes that make up the front, mid, and back lines of teams. In case it isn't obvious, the black E stands for the enemy team. The front line is made up of champions in the Diver, Vanguard, and Juggernaut classes. These are some of the tankiest champions in the game. Divers and Vanguards are great for initiating fights, and Juggernauts are great for counter-engage. The midline consists of Catchers, Wardens, and Battle Mages. Catchers are great at starting fights, but they typically are less tanky than Divers and Vanguards, so they stay a bit further back. Wardens are just as tanky as Divers and Vanguards, but they stay further back because their job is frequently to peel for their backline rather than to engage onto the enemy team. Battle Mages are also midline champions because they typically have shorter ranges than the backline champions. Off to the sides of the midline, I have Assassins and Skirmishers. The reason why these classes are separated is because they're usually better in a side lane or a flanking position rather than grouping with the team. Assassins and Skirmishers excel in picking off lone opponents, so they frequently push the side lanes and then hide in the fog of war to jump onto an unsuspecting victim who comes to clear the wave. Juggernauts are also great at split pushing and may not group with the team, but they don't have the same flanking potential of Assassins and Skirmishers. The back line consists of Enchanters, Marksmen, Burst Mages, and Artillery Mages. Artillery Mages are slightly behind the other three classes because they have the longest ranges in the game. Marksmen, Burst Mages, and Artillery Mages are the primary ways that teams deal damage from range, so they want to be as far away from the enemy team as possible. Enchanters also typically stay in the backline because they excel in peeling for their squishy carries. Alright, so now that we've gone through all 5 attributes, you should have at least one subclass that matches your desired attributes. For example, my favorite memories of League are when I make a shot call to look for a team fight, and my decisiveness results in us smashing the enemy team and either getting a crucial objective like Baron or outright winning the game. I like to engage, I like to be tanky, and I like to have some hard crowd control with at least a little bit of damage. Based on my responses, Divers or Vanguards would be a good choice for me. You may not have a 100% match, but you should have at least one class that checks most of your boxes. If you can't determine the best subclass for you, then leave a comment with your priorities and I'll try to help you out. Now we're going to go through each subclass and really dig into what makes them special and discuss how each champion within each subclass is unique. I won't be going into super amounts of detail on each subclass, I'll just be giving you a general overview of what to expect from each subclass. I will be doing dedicated videos for each subclass, going over all of the nuances of the subclass and going into detail on each champion. If there's a particular subclass video you want me to do first, then leave a comment below. If you're only interested in learning about one or two of the subclasses and you don't want to watch the rest of the video, I've time-stamped each subclass in the video description below. First up, we have the Assassins. Assassins are a terrifying combination of mobility and burst damage that strikes fear into pretty much every squishy champion in the game. When ahead, Assassins can feel unstoppable. When behind, though, they can feel useless. Assassins are truly defined by how they engage their victims and how they escape once they've secured the kill. In general, there are three ways that Assassins accomplish their goals: stealth, mobility, and evasiveness. Stealth comes in two forms: camouflage and invisibility. Camouflage, also called strategic stealth, is long-term stealth that renders the target undetectable as long as there aren't any champions or vision wards close by. Camouflage is basically an out-of-combat stealth. Invisibility, or tactical stealth, is an in-combat stealth which typically only lasts a second or two, but can only be defeated by turrets or true sight. Assassins with a form of stealth are Evelyn, Shaco, Kha'Zix, Talon, and Akali. Mobility is just what it sounds like: ways for the assassin to gap close or traverse walls quickly. Every assassin has some form of mobility, but champions like Kassadin and Katarina only have mobility, and thus they have their mobility on much lower cooldowns than other champions. Evasiveness is basically the ability for a champion to become untargetable for a brief moment, allowing them to dodge potent damage or crowd control abilities. Assassins with evasiveness are Evelyn, Shaco, Zed, and Fizz. Next up are the Skirmishers. Skirmishers are the unparalleled duelists of League of Legends. They have very high damage and very good mobility. However, what really defines Skirmishers are their conditional defenses. Every Skirmisher has at least one ability which, when used properly, can make them feel extremely difficult to kill. However, if you use that ability improperly, a Skirmisher can be killed very easily. The three forms of conditional defenses that Skirmishers have are mobility, durability, and threat. Special shout out to Crit Keeper for an excellent post on these different forms of conditional defenses and what makes a Skirmisher a Skirmisher. I've included a link to Crit Keeper's post in the video description below. Mobility can take the form of crowd control reduction or removal, dashes, blinks, movement speed boosts, or anything else that makes a Skirmisher more difficult to crowd control or hit with skill shots. Durability includes things such as shields, heals, and vulnerability, bonus resistances, or anything that makes a Skirmisher extremely difficult to burst down or kill. Threat includes things such as AoE damage, crowd control, or massive effects that can single-handedly win a fight. All these Skirmishers possess at least a little bit of each of these conditional defenses, but each Skirmisher has each conditional defense in different amounts. The Skirmishers who rely primarily on mobility are Master Yi and Riven. The Skirmishers who rely primarily on tankiness are Tryndamere, Jax, and Kled. And the Skirmishers who rely primarily on threat are Echo and Fiora. Yasuo has about equal parts of mobility, durability, and threat, which is why he's in the middle. Let's move on to the fighter class and first talk about divers. Divers, at their core, are jack of all trades. They have damage, they have tankiness, they have crowd control, and they have mobility. The true strength of divers is they are extremely versatile, and they can adapt their build for whatever their team needs or whatever best counters the enemy team. Divers are really separated by what kind of damage they deal and what kind of toughness they have. First off, I want to say that all divers can deal a ton of burst damage if they are built glass cannon. How a champion is built does not determine whether or not they're on the burst side or the DPS side of this chart. What determines which side a diver falls on is based on their kit. On the top side, we have divers that primarily deal burst damage, meaning that they favor comboing all of their abilities together as rapidly as possible. On the bottom side, we have divers that primarily deal DPS damage, meaning that they frequently weave in auto attacks between abilities, or they are more auto-attack focused than the other divers. On the left side, we have divers who favor mitigation toughness, and on the right side, we have divers who favor sustained toughness. Divers who favor burst and mitigation are Pantheon, Diana, Elise, Wukong, and Lee Sin. Divers who favor burst and sustain are Rengar, Renekton, Rek'Sai, and Hecarim. Divers who favor DPS and mitigation are Jarvan, Nocturne, Vi, and Camille. And divers who favor DPS and sustain are Irelia, Warwick, Xin Zhao, and Aatrox. One common mistake that a lot of players make is they assume that divers who favor burst damage are assassins. That is incorrect. The primary difference between divers and assassins is that assassins have a way to escape once they jump into a fight. Divers can deal damage comparable to assassins if they build glass cannon, but they can never be a true assassin without an escape. Elise and Wukong could be considered hybrid assassins, since they do have abilities that allow them to escape, but other divers lack ways to escape once they engage. Another common mistake that players make is they assume that divers who are good at dueling are skirmishers. This includes Renekton, Camille, and Irelia. While it can definitely be argued that these champions are hybrid skirmishers, they align better with the diver class than the skirmisher class. One of the big differences between divers and skirmishers is that divers are designed to be able to reach the backline rather effortlessly with either targeted or long-range dashes. Skirmishers typically have shorter range dash abilities, very strong conditional defenses, and have very target agnostic damage, meaning that they can cut through tanks and squishy targets alike. Ananagon made a very good post about the differences between skirmishers and divers if you're interested. I'll make sure that I include a link to his post below. Next, we're going to talk about Juggernauts. Put bluntly, Juggernauts are the 1v2, 1v3, even 1v5 kings. They have very high damage and very high tankiness, and they're extremely difficult to take down due to their sustain. However, they lack a lot of mobility, crowd control, and utility, which makes them very vulnerable to kiting. Juggernauts love it when the enemy teams engage into them, but they struggle against teams that can poke them from range or keep them away from high priority targets. Special thanks to Dragon Shay for a great job defining Juggernauts. I've linked his post in the video description below. There are two types of Juggernauts, raid bosses and freight trains. Raid bosses are shown on the top and freight trains are shown on the bottom. Within each type of Juggernaut, there are those who are more ability-based and there are those who are more attack-based. Ability-based champions are shown on the left and attack-based champions are shown on the right. In the upper left are the raid bosses who rely on their abilities. These are the true titans of League, able to take on entire enemy teams by themselves if they use their abilities correctly. However, these Juggernauts are also some of the most immobile champions in the game, with very limited forms of crowd control. These Juggernauts are Alawi, Darius, Mordekaiser, and Urgot. In the upper right, we have the raid bosses who rely on their attacks. These raid bosses all have spammable auto-attack augmentations on their Q, which is their primary source of damage and sustain. Each of these raid bosses synergizes very well with Sheen items and can take down towers extremely quick with their enhanced auto attacks. They also all have ultimates which makes them even more fearsome in combat and allow them to turn the tide of a battle even when numbers aren't in their favor. These Juggernauts are Nasus, Yorick, and Trundle. In the bottom left, we have the freight trains who rely on their abilities. Each of these champions have ways of sticking to their target, while they rapidly chip away at their health with either spammable spells or damage over time abilities. These freight trains have more CC and more mobility than their raid boss cousins, but they also have slightly lower damage and tankiness. These Juggernauts are Garen, Dr. Mundo, and Skarner. In the bottom right are the freight trains who rely on their attacks. These are the fastest moving Juggernauts and can shred through tanks and squishy champions alike with their brutal, rapid attacks. These Juggernauts are Volibear, Olaf, Udyr, and Shyvana. Now we're going to move on to the tank classes, and the first tank class we're going to talk about are the Vanguards. Vanguards thrive on chaos and excel in the thick of a team fight. What makes Vanguards unique is their terrifying amounts of AoE crowd control and their engage, which can turn the tide of any team fight when executed correctly. Vanguards are really defined by how they use their crowd control and how they initiate into team fights. There are 3 types of Vanguards: Wombo, Flank, and Isolate. Wombo Vanguards are known for their terrifying AoE crowd control ultimates that can engulf entire enemy teams and set up the ultimates of other champions. They typically have extremely long engage ranges that allow them to get into the heart of the enemy team before unleashing their mayhem. The Wombo Vanguards are Mumu, Malphite, Zac, and Leona. Flank Vanguards are those who excel at hitting the enemy team from the side or behind. Their abilities are great at cutting off retreat paths and splitting enemy teams up, allowing you to pick off stragglers. The Flank Vanguards are Ornn, Sion, Maokai, and Rammus. Isolate Vanguards specialize jumping onto a single target and crowd controlling them for what feels like an eternity, forcing the enemy team to either leave them for dead or risk being aced. The Isolate Vanguards are Sejuani, Alistar, Nautilus, and Gragas. The second tank class we're going to talk about are the Wardens. Wardens are unique because of their combination of tankiness, crowd control, and utility. Wardens are masters at protecting their allies, and while they can be decent at engaging, they usually don't have the same engage potential as a Vanguard. There are 3 traits which make each Warden unique: engage, utility, and damage. Traditionally, the more utility a Warden has, the less damage and engage they can have. Poppy is the Warden with the least utility and has a good blend of engage and damage. Shen and Galio have decent amounts of engage, utility, and damage. They're a good blend of each, but they don't excel in any one area. Braum is the master of engage and utility, but he doesn't have that much damage, while Tahm Kench is great at utility and has a surprising amount of damage, but he has very little engage. Finally, we have Nunu, who has very little engage or damage, but he has a ton of utility. We're now moving on to the controller class, and the first subclass we're going to talk about are the catchers. Catchers really are all about their crowd control. They have some of the craziest crowd control in the game, and they're phenomenal at enabling their team to get picks. On top of their crowd control, catchers have 3 other things that make them unique: utility, mobility, and damage. Ivern is the king of utility within the catcher class. Rakan and Thresh are decent combinations of utility and mobility, but Rakan definitely has more mobility, while Thresh provides more crowd control and utility. Bard is kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to catchers, having utility, mobility, and damage, while not being the best in any of the areas. Blitzcrank has some of the craziest crowd control out of any of the catchers, and also has some very strategic mobility combined with surprising damage. Morgana and Zyra are the least mobile of the catchers, but they also have the highest damage of any of the catchers. Morgana has slightly less damage than Zyra, but she also has more utility than Zyra. The second controller class we're going to talk about are the Enchanters. What makes Enchanters unique is their amazing ability to keep their allies alive. While many classes are masters of death, the Enchanters are the masters of life, and their ability to keep their squishy damage dealers alive can single-handedly win a team fight. All Enchanters have either heals, shields, or both. In addition to their utility, Enchanters are unique in 3 ways: mobility, crowd control, and damage. Karma is a good mix of damage and mobility, but she doesn't have a lot of crowd control. Lulu and Sona have a little bit of everything, but they aren't amazing in any one area. Nami and Taric are more crowd control focused, though Nami does grant mobility from her passive. Taric also has more tankiness than any of the other enchanters and is considered to be a hybrid warden. Soraka and Janna are the most utility focused out of all of the enchanters, but they do also have some mobility and some crowd control. Alright, We're going to move on to the mage classes, and I'm going to do something that I'm sure is going to piss a few people off. I'm going to combine the burst mages and the artillery mages together, and we're going to talk about both of those classes at the same time. Burst mages and artillery mages are long-range spellcasters who rely on poking enemies with a relatively low cooldown ability, usually their Q ability, until that enemy is in kill range. Once in kill range, both classes will hit their target with a crowd control ability and then kill them with the rest of their combo. Both classes are phenomenal at destroying squishy champions, but struggle immensely against tanks or other classes that can close the distance on them. The primary difference between burst mages and artillery mages is range. Artillery mages have the longest range in the game. This results in artillery mages being able to spam their abilities more often than burst mages, since they more frequently have a target within their range, causing artillery mages to have more consistent DPS damage than burst mages. That said, an artillery mage can burst a squishy champion with a full combo just as easily as a burst mage can. What artillery mages really give up for this increased range is mobility and crowd control reliability. Let's compare the artillery mages to the AoE burst mages like Orianna or Lux. Can you honestly say that the difference between Orianna and Vel'Koz is more than the difference between Annie and Twisted Fate? Can you honestly say that the difference between Xerath and Lux is more than the difference between Ahri and LeBlanc? I'd argue that the differences are pretty comparable. And if that's the case, then why are we separating out the artillery mages? Aren't artillery mages just a subsect of burst mages who are defined by their massive range and their AoE abilities? In my opinion, there are three things that define burst mages, including the artillery mages, and make them unique: mobility, lockdown, and AoE damage. I've also included champion range in this graphic. Champions closer to the center have shorter range, and champions closer to the edge have longer range. Mobility burst mages are similar to assassins because they have both mobility and burst damage. However, they differ from assassins because their abilities and their auto attacks have greater range than assassins. Mobility burst mages are great at picking off single targets, but they have less reliable crowd control and less AoE damage than other burst mages. The mobility burst mages are Ahri, LeBlanc, Zoe, and Lissandra. However, Lissandra is a very unique burst mage because she has a little bit of everything. She has mobility, she has lockdown, she has AoE damage. However, what she really lacks is range, and some people would argue that her burst damage is slightly lower than the other burst mages. Lockdown burst mages are those who have high crowd control reliability. Their crowd control is either point and click, or it has a massive AoE that is relatively easy to hit. These burst mages have the highest pick potential in the game, but they lack mobility and either range or AoE damage potential. The lockdown burst mages are Annie, Twisted Fate, Veigar, and Syndra. AoE burst mages are primarily skill shot based champions who can deal massive damage over large AoEs. These burst mages are the best team fighters among the burst mages, but they don't have as much pick potential as the mobility or the lockdown burst mages. The AoE burst mages are Brand, Orianna, and Lux, and they also include the three artillery mages, Ziggs, Xerath, and Vel'Koz. The final mage subclass are the battle mages. This is a really diverse class, but what defines them as a whole is their shorter range and their massive DPS damage. Battle mages are great at controlling areas of the battlefield, having potent threat areas that allow them to kill anyone foolish enough to enter. However, they are considerably less mobile than other champions, so they struggle against poking and kiting comps, or comps that have a lot of crowd control. There are three types of battle mages: tanky, focused, and AoE. Tanky battle mages like Swain and Vladimir have unparalleled sustain and love to be in the center of a team fight. While they may not build purely defensive items, they can survive much longer than other battle mages. Focused battle mages are those who deal high DPS to a single target. This can be from either damage over time abilities like Malzahar, or from machine gun casters who spam spells like Rise or Cassiopeia. Finally, we have the AoE battle mages. These champions deal massive amounts of AoE damage, but generally have less tankiness than the tanky battle mages, and less single target DPS than the focus battle mages. These champions that fall under this sector are Rumble, Victor, Aurelion Sol, Anivia, and Talia. In the center we have Karthus, who has a little bit of everything. He's a machine gun caster like Rise and Cassiopeia, but his spammable spells are AoE, and all of his other abilities are AoE as well. And while he isn't as tanky as Vladimir or Swain, he excels in the center of a team fight thanks to his passive. Alright, let's now talk about the Marksmen. Marksmen are tied for the largest class in the game with Divers, and are arguably the most diverse class in League of Legends. What ultimately defines Marksmen, though, is their ability to do consistent DPS from range, primarily with their auto attacks. However, Marksmen vary widely in how much range, mobility, sustain, crowd control, and utility they have. If you remember earlier in the video, I said that Marksmen were so diverse that they could have their own spectrum. I wasn't lying. On the screen you can see which class each Marksman is most like. In the center we have what you could call the quote-unquote pure Marksmen, or the Marksmen who are unlike any other class. These are what people stereotypically think of when they think of a Marksman. Long range and auto attack based with great wave clear, team fighting, and tower taking. These Marksmen are Tristana, Xayah, Jinx, and Caitlyn. In the upper left we have Twitch and Vayne, who are most common to assassins, though in many ways Vayne is also a skirmisher due to her insane dueling power. These are the only Marksmen with stealth, Twitch possessing camouflage and Vayne possessing invisibility. When a fed Twitch or Vayne is in the game, you have to completely change how you play, just like you would have to if there was a fed assassin in the game. Any brush could hide certain death, and anytime you push a lane alone, you're risking your life. Beneath them are the Marksmen who are most similar to Skirmishers, Callista, Lucian, and Draven. These are the dueling Marksmen. Each of these Marksmen have a strong laning phase, and they snowball very hard into the mid-game thanks to their high damage output and mobility. However, due to their reduced range, they often struggle in late-game team fights. Additionally, if they don't snowball early, they often get outscaled by other Marksmen. On the left we have Jhin and Misfortune, who are most similar to the Burst Mage class. These Marksmen can chunk you for half of your health with a single attack or ability, but they often lack the sustained DPS of other Marksmen. They're great against squishy teams, but they struggle against teams with lots of tanks or engage. In the lower left we have Corki and Ezreal, who are closest to artillery mages. Both of these Marksmen have long-range, spammable abilities that are extremely skill-shot reliant. However, they lack crowd control like true artillery mages, but they do have increased mobility to make up for that. Directly above them is Kog'Maw, who's an interesting blend of artillery mage, battle mage, and Marksman. His ultimate gives him artillery mage poke, along with his insane auto attack range when his W is activated. He's also similar to a battle mage because Kog'Maw outputs some of the highest DPS in the game if you stand in his threat zone. I don't care who you are, a late game Kog'Maw will kill you if you don't immediately crowd control and kill him first. To the right we have Kindred, who is most closely associated with the Enchanter class thanks to her crowd control and her powerful death-defying ultimate. Beneath Kindred we have Sivir, who has some potent utility in the form of her ultimate and great self-peel from her spell shield. Finally, we have the Marksmen who are closest to the catchers, Varus and Ashe. Ashe is the quintessential utility Marksman with amazing crowd control on her ultimate and her W and amazing utility on her E. I know that some people might be butthurt that I didn't include Varus with the artillery mages, but that's mainly because Varus' build varies widely depending on the meta. Sometimes he's played as a lethality artillery mage, sometimes he's played as an attack speed, tank shredding Marksman. But regardless of what the meta is, Varus always has amazing catch potential with his ultimate. And if you doubt the catch potential of Ashe or Varus, just ask Faker how Game 3 of the 2017 World Championship went. This brings us to our final class, the specialists, the oddball, and the unique playstyles. Regardless of what you call them, these guys are the redheaded stepchildren of League, but they probably think of themselves as the champions who are too cool to be part of any class or subclass. Each of these champions have very, very different playstyles than other champions, and traditionally require a lot of experience to be played competently. Like Marksmen, the specialists are also so diverse that they could have their own spectrum. At the top, Kane is a combination of assassin and diver, leaning more towards diver when he transforms into Rast, and more of an assassin when he transforms into Shadow Assassin. Moving left, Graves and Quinn are a combination of skirmisher and marksman, possessing terrifying dueling capabilities while simultaneously being ranged. Gangplank is a combination of skirmisher and battle mage, possessing amazing late-game scaling with absolutely insane AoE damage. Jace is a combination of skirmisher and artillery mage, possessing the range of an artillery mage in cannon form and the dueling power of a skirmisher in hammer form. Nidalee is a combination of assassin and artillery mage, possessing the range of an artillery mage in human form and the mobility and burst damage of an assassin in cougar form. Kennen and Azir both possess battle mage and marksman properties, though Kennen leads more towards battle mage with his iconic ultimate, and Azir more towards marksman with his auto attack focused kit. Teemo is closest to the marksman class, but his kit also has aspect of battle mage, thanks to his damage over time abilities and his zone control. He's also pure evil, so I just stay away from him if you value your soul. Fiddlesticks and Heimerdinger are two of the most unique champions in the game. They really aren't like any other class, but if I had to place them somewhere, I'd say they're closest to the battle mages. Both have shorter ranges, but amazing kill potential if enemies enter their threat zone. Zilean is another weird one. He's kind of part battle mage, part enchanter, and part catcher. His bombs give him the zone control of a battle mage, while his speed up and his revive give him the utility of an enchanter, and his slow and his bombs also give him the catch potential of a catcher. Kayle is a really interesting combination of damage and utility, making her kind of a hybrid of marksman and enchanter classes. Her kit is very enchanter focused, with a slow, a heal, a movement speed boost, and an invulnerability ultimate, but her E also allows her to deal massive damage with her auto attacks once she gets a few items. Gnar is another transforming champion who is a combination of two classes. In this case, he's a marksman when he's in mini form, and he's a vanguard when he's in mega form. He's the only champion in the game with this squishy tanky duality. Finally, we have Singed and Cho'Gath. These champions are kind of part tank and part juggernaut, but they don't really fit into either class. Singed is a hyper-fast DPS-based tank who wins by relentlessly split pushing and annoying the enemy team so much that they chase him and waste time and resources trying to kill him. Cho'Gath is a giant, slow, lumbering void monster that can chomp you for over 1,000 true damage if you get too close, who also possesses one of the most powerful crowd controls in the game, an AoE silence. And that's it. We're done with all of the classes. If you're still here and you watched the entire video, then I applaud you. As I said earlier, if you still don't know what subclass is right for you, please leave a comment with your priorities and I'll try to help you out. Additionally, I plan on doing separate videos for every subclass. So if there's a subclass in particular that interests you, leave a comment and I'll try to prioritize those videos. This video took a lot of time to create. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. And if you made it this far in the video, why not subscribe to my channel? I try to put out high quality content like this as often as I can, and I do my best to answer as many questions as I can for you guys. Thank you to everyone who has supported my channel over the years, and a very special thank you to everyone who helped me make this video or who wrote articles that I linked below. I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Randomonium, signing off.
the following.